Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. Today, we're diving into an essential topic that's key to better understanding ourselves and strengthening our relationships. And that is primary and secondary emotions. If you tuned into my recent episode on first order change versus second order change, think of this as a companion episode. Now, if you haven't tuned into that episode yet, it's just a few episodes back, maybe 2 or 3 episodes back. And you don't necessarily need to listen to that one before this one, but I think they can be companion episodes. So while these concepts that I'm going to talk about today, primary and secondary emotions, and then first order versus second order change, stand independently on their own. They're each their own concept. I think they share an important similarity. They both reflect a distinction between what is readily visible, think of the tip of the iceberg, and what lies deeper beneath the surface, reaching all the way to our core. Primary emotions are deeply rooted and essential to driving meaningful second order change. In contrast, secondary, like first order changes, offer only temporary relief, or they may reinforce repetitive or may reinforce patterns of unproductive conversations and unresolved conflict. So let me start with a question. Have you ever found yourself or wondered why you react so strongly to a certain situation that the situation doesn't seem to warrant such a strong reaction? Some examples of this that I can think of off the top of my head. For the individual, road rage. For example, another driver cuts you off slightly, but you respond with extreme anger, shouting, gesturing aggressively, or driving aggressively, far beyond the normal irritation of traffic inconvenience. The secondary emotions may be anger and rage. The underlying primary emotion may be about feeling disrespected or feeling powerless and vulnerable. Another example that I can think of that might happen for an individual is your supervisor at work provides constructive criticism about a small mistake that you made, and you instantly become overly defensive. You're reacting as though your boss is firing you. You argue back strongly, or you just shut down emotionally. Those would all be secondary reactive emotions. The underlying primary emotion may be a fear of inadequacy or toxic shame or insecurity about your competence or your worth. If we put this into relationships, some examples may be your partner forgets to load the dishwasher after dinner. And in the morning when you wake up, you notice this and you become disproportionately upset, accusing them of not being trustworthy or not. The underlying primary emotion may be about feeling on your own, unappreciated, insignificant, and overlooked. Another example that can happen in relationships is that initially, at the beginning of the relationship, the two of you bonded deeply with each other over shared religious beliefs. But when your partner starts to shift their belief system and they start to express doubt, you become extremely distressed, angry, critical, accusing them of being dishonest or telling them how wrong they are. So the primary emotion or the underlying emotions to these secondary emotional reactions could be a fear of abandonment, a fear of incompetence. Maybe you're feeling this insecurity around your beliefs being wrong. You might fear a loss of connection or have anxiety about the instability and uncertainty in your relationship. And then let's put it into a social situation where your partner enjoys chatting and joking at social gatherings, but you become intensely irritated. You isolate yourself, sit over to the side. Internally, you're fuming. And on the way home, you accuse them of ignoring you or seeking attention excessively. The underlying primary emotions might have to do with feelings of insecurity, feelings of not being enough, jealousy, fears of being less important or not mattering. These examples illustrate how secondary emotional reactions, though they may be vivid and easily recognized, they're right there on the surface, and they might even seem legitimate. However, they mask deeper, vulnerable emotions or wounds at our core. Recognizing these secondary reactions allows for deeper exploration and more meaningful conversations, and ultimately healthier relational dynamic. Understanding this concept of primary emotions and secondary emotions can be a game changer. I've seen for many couples that I've worked with, when they start to understand these concepts, and maybe it happens, they have a conflict and their secondary reactions, and they start to argue over that. And one notices, hey, this is secondary emotions that are coming up. This emotional response is a lot larger than what happened. What happened may have been a trigger, but what's actually going on are these deeper primary emotions. And instead of staying in the content of what the fight is about, the partner of this person who's reacting pauses for a minute and says, what's actually going on with you? I don't believe this is about whatever the conflict originated with. Just say, I don't think it's really about this. This is an issue we can certainly talk through, come to some decision making about. It doesn't require quite such an emotional response. So talk to me. Tell me what's happening underneath all of this. Those conversations can lead to healing wounds at the core. They can lead to, as I said, more meaningful connections and healthier relational dynamics. So what are primary emotions? Primary emotions are our immediate instinctive reactions. Now, these may not be known in the conscious mind, but they come naturally, without thought, and they tend to be universal across cultures. Primary emotions are believed to be innate and directly tied to a situation. I'll talk about what happens with trauma because they may not be tied to a specific situation in the present. Primary emotions are often considered basic and fundamental, whereas secondary emotions are learned and can be influenced by thoughts and interpretation. Some more examples of primary emotions. There might be sadness and deep grief and sorrow at a loss. There may be fear in response to a real or perceived threat. You might feel joy at a positive event, anger about a boundary violation, an unfairness or injustice, surprise and disgust. Think of primary emotions as signals. They tell us something significant has just happened or is happening within or around us. They may be innate, as I've said, or they may stem from our insecurities, our trauma beliefs, and our core wounds. Recognizing primary emotions can help us quickly identify our needs or threats, which can lead to connecting conversations with a partner or a loved one, a deeper understanding of ourselves or our partner, and can lead to conversations that feel resolved and speak to our attachment needs. So just summarizing, the characteristics about primary emotions are they often occur without much thought. They are believed to be innate and universal. They serve a survival purpose, such as fear prompting a fight or flight response, or the hair standing up on the back of your neck. And they are a direct response to a stimulus, rather than a reaction to a prior emotion. They're not necessarily masking anything. Secondary emotions are more complex. They arise from our reactions or judgments about primary emotions. For instance, feeling ashamed about being angry or anxious, or about feeling sadness, those are common examples. Secondary emotions can be tricky because they layer additional feelings on top of the original emotion, often making emotional experiences confusing, overwhelming, big, hidden, or unknown. Being able to start to recognize secondary emotions, whether that's in you or your partner, is crucial because they obscure the true underlying issue. So let's talk about the relationship between primary and secondary emotions. Often, secondary emotions mask the underlying primary emotions. For example, when someone feels hurt, which is a primary emotion, they might express anger. I will say a lot of emotions can be primary emotions or secondary emotions. It depends on the circumstance. So going back to this example, someone feels hurt, and that's their primary emotion. But instead, they express anger, making that a secondary emotion because anger feels safer or it's less vulnerable. By identifying the primary emotion beneath the secondary reaction, we can actually address the issue more directly. Understanding this relationship between primary and secondary emotions enhances emotional intelligence, personal insight, and make emotional conversations more authentic and effective. So when we're talking about trauma, trauma can be an event, or it can be the meaning we assign to an event, or it can be both. So now let's talk about what happens with trauma. Trauma can be an event. Sometimes I'll say what happened that should not have, or it can be the meaning we assign. This might be the meaning we assign to an event. So that's both of them. It's an event and the meaning we assign to that, or the beliefs we create about ourselves about this event. Or in some cases, trauma is pervasive. It's consistent and frequent. This is often the categories of neglect, where it's challenging to pinpoint a specific event because it's characterized by the absence of something we needed. There's nothing to put our finger on, so to speak. So we frequently internalize this lack, creating a belief about ourselves, such as something must be wrong with me. I don't deserve attention. My wants or my needs are too much, or I am too much. As children and teens, fully recognizing the impact of these events and their associated meanings can feel overwhelming or threatening to our developing psyches. Consequently, these experiences often remain hidden beneath the surface of conscious awareness. Eventually, however, there comes a time in adulthood when the cost of keeping these truths buried outweighs the discomfort of facing them. Secondary emotions often serve as valuable indicators here, guiding us inward with curiosity to uncover deeper feelings and experiences. For example, a client might show up to therapy, and in that first session, they're asked what brings them into therapy. And they say, I have anger issues, and my wife or my kids have asked me to go to therapy. That's an awareness of their secondary emotion, and it's an indicator that something's not okay. And they may decide to work on that, to pursue therapy so that they can understand that better, initially coming in just to fix their anger. But anger, when clients are coming in with anger, that's typically not all that is going on. I will say anger is often, it's a common secondary emotion that people use because anger does not feel vulnerable. It's used a lot to mask or hide a lot of vulnerable primary emotions. But as I said in the examples of anger, whether that's a boundary being crossed or something wrong that happened to us, unfairness, injustice, things like that, anger is more of a primary emotion. Sometimes you'll hear there are people who will say anger is always a secondary emotion, covering a primary emotion. And like I just said, I think that's common, but I don't think it's true to say anger is universally a secondary emotion because we have no use at a core level for anger. And I think we do. Anger acts as an alarm system. Anger hits us in a way that requires us to take action, to be aware, to put in place a boundary, or to do something if we're trying to protest an injustice or correct an unfairness. The exploration of secondary emotions paves the way toward healing and the development of earned secure attachment. Without this healing, our attachment injuries will haunt our relationships and prevent us from moving forward to safety and repair. Now, there is some good news when it comes to trauma, and that is not every wound or injury point has to be individually addressed. Instead, we can look for patterns. What are the ones that keep coming back? They keep resurfacing. Address these big ones, and often others heal with them. I want to slightly go on a tangent, but I promise that I will tie this back into our topic of primary and secondary emotions and healing. So I want to introduce you to a model. I want to introduce you to a model we call the adaptive information processing model. This model posits, I'm not going to go into the whole model, but I'm going to give you a part of it. So this model posits that the present difficulties we are experiencing as human beings are informed by past experiences that are inadequately processed and maladaptively stored. That's a lot of syllables to say at one time. But you may have heard me say a time or two or 10 in different episodes that part of the definition of addiction is that it's a maladaptive coping mechanism. And that leads us to ask, what are addicts coping with? And that question is the basis for healing and recovery work. For example, let's use the case of a young child who spills their milk at the dinner table, and their father erupts with anger, yelling at this young child. How could you do that? With a loud voice, a stern look, the child is shocked. There's a feeling internally of fear, anxiety, shame. And without any other mitigating information or intervention by somebody else, the child is going to walk away with that image, the thoughts that came up with that, the feelings, the sensation in their body, and they're going to form some beliefs because we have to make meaning of our experiences. Those beliefs might sound like, what I did caused his anger, so therefore it's my fault, I'm the bad one. Now, again, depending on the age of this child, they don't have that coherent thought process happening, development in their brain yet, but that sense in the body, those sensations, that feeling make meaning that says something's wrong with me. I did this, Dad yelled, something's wrong with me. I caused his anger. So that's an example of how our memories are maladaptively stored. Because in this example, the child didn't have adequate access to information to help him or her with a more adaptive conclusion. If we go back to that example, but this time the mother comes over and takes the child and says, it's okay, this is not your fault. Your father's having a bad day. I mean, I would probably add, it's not okay for him to get angry about spilled milk. Maybe the mother turns to the father and says, hey, maybe you need to go in the other room and regulate yourself. Because for the father, his outburst is reactive. And that would be a secondary emotion. It's not really about the spilled milk. I mean, yeah, I've been a parent to 4 kids. I have had milk. I'm not really a milk drinker, so my kids therefore weren't much of a milk drinker. We didn't really have milk at meals. But let's say water, and my child spills the entire cup of water and it runs into my lap, and all of a sudden I've got cold water on me, and I might jump up and have a response, but I don't get mad at the child for doing that. Instead, I'm saying, oh, let's grab a towel. Let's mop up the water. If the child's sitting there and they're wet, I'll move them away and say, okay, let's get you away. We're mopping that up. We're not giving those emotions to the child about the fact that they spilled their glass of water. So let's say this happens. Mom comes in, helps the child make sense, letting them know this is Dad's response. This is about him. It's not about you. Now we have a beginning to this with the start of the spilled milk. We have a middle where dad gets up, yells, screams at the child, and we have an end to that experience where mom comes in and says, hey, this wasn't your fault. Dad's upset. Dad's had a bad day. This isn't about you. So in that child's nervous system, there was an arousal and then there was a de-arousal because the mother came and intervened. She offered that information that said, this is not about you. And so that memory, even though it's not a happy memory, it gets stored differently. It gets stored as an adaptive memory because there's a conclusion to it. There's an emotional, somatic conclusion to it. Somatic meaning the feelings in the body were regulated by mom. So there's arousal and then there's de-arousal back to emotional regulation. But let's add some more resolution to that. Dad goes in the other room, spends some time regulating himself, and comes back to his child and apologizes, saying, hey, that wasn't okay for me to get mad at you about something that was an accident. I shouldn't have done that. Those were my emotions, not about you. Dad takes ownership, which is where that belongs with dad. And then the child does not internalize that belief or does not make meaning of that incident that says, I'm bad. So those are more adaptively stored memories. There might be some positive ones, there can be negative ones, but they are adaptively stored. It's not causing maladaptiveness in our development. Let's talk about how memory networks work for a minute. Memory networks are memories that are clustered along similar sections or similar themes. So let's take this example to make the point. Let's take this example of the child spilling the milk. And let's say that his father loses his job. Let's say the father hasn't regulated, come back and apologized. Mom did not intervene. So the father loses his job. He's now more and more agitated and angry. And now he's starting to react to his kids' age-appropriate behaviors. And this is happening on a regular basis. And now this kid is starting to collect a number of these experiences. And that becomes more the rule than the exception. Over time, this kid begins to identify with these experiences. He may think, yeah, I really am a bad person. There must be something wrong with me. So when this child grows up and finds themselves in therapy, part of what we're looking for is how do the client's memory networks look? To what extent are these networks adaptively stored, where the information is congruent with the experience, as in the first example of, oh, my dad was just having a hard time. I'm okay. I'm a good person. It wasn't about me. Or I'm safe. I was always safe. Dad might have overreacted and yelled, but then he went in his room and came out and apologized. These would be adaptive memories. Adaptive meaning the ability to reframe traumatic or stressful experiences in a way that allows for emotional recovery and resolution. In the case of secondary emotions, forgetting or putting these experiences out of our awareness to reduce interference with other memories that maybe serve the child better, like I had a good childhood or my parents loved me, would also be a way of temporarily adaptively storing those memories. We're suppressing those memories and we're bringing up these other ones of my parents loved me and I have memories to go along with that, or I had a good childhood and there are memories to go along with that. However, the way I would say it is these other memories that we repressed that are maladaptively stored are going to start coming up sideways, or they're going to start coming up and they're not in alignment with the situation in which the person is reacting to. Now, any good, well-trained, trauma-informed therapist is going to have an idea of what kind of experiences they're going to get into with the client before they start doing any type of trauma work. They have a map of the general emotional landscape they've created in sessions with the client and the questions they ask. Now, that said, on the other hand, as therapists, we often don't know how their brain connects what's informing the current difficulty. that isn't necessarily a memory we've been given yet. We might be given the current difficulty or the current situation, but the client may not know the story that goes with that. And therefore, we don't know the story that goes with that. Part of what's always fascinating to me, and I continue to this day to be completely fascinated, if not surprised, by how our brain links memories together in a way that may not be logical to you and me. But it certainly informs the client's or the person's difficulties in a way that is beyond what we would think to interpret or identify or put together. I'm a big believer that all behavior makes sense. And if something isn't making sense, if some behavior isn't making sense, we haven't uncovered enough of the story for it to make sense. It's not uncommon for me as a therapist to have a client come in, and at one point they're coming in, they're talking about a conflict they had with their spouse. And then they share an experience that happened in elementary school. And the next, they're talking about a time in high school, and then we're back to adulthood. Clients will say something, they'll notice that, and they'll say, wow, I'm all over the board today. For them, it seems scattered. For me, I'm tying it together. I'm seeing a pattern with beliefs. Maybe all of these memories they gave me from their current conflict with spouse to the time in elementary school to high school, back to adulthood. They're tied together with this belief of I'm not enough, I'm not safe, as well as the sensation in their body. Usually early on, the clients that I work with are pretty disconnected from their body. So they're not aware of that yet. So in that regard, there is this inherent wisdom using the client's neurobiology to access how all of this is connected, rather than as a therapist having to figure it out in advance, make guesses or assumptions. Working this way, memory is a means to an end, as well as an end in itself. So what that means is if we take a representative experience, so let's say someone's really feeling incompetent at work, and one of the representative experiences is coming home with 5 A's and a B. Not a particularly uncommon or remarkable experience, but for this client, it was representative of a daily dose of being criticized by one or both of their parents. In that moment, at that time in their life, this was a daily diet of, I'm not good enough no matter what I do. So in therapy, when we bring that memory to mind now, and we ask, give me an image of what that looks like. Sometimes I'll ask them, what's in this story that you just shared with me, in this memory that you just shared with me? Is there something that represents the worst part of that? Sometimes they respond to that, sometimes they don't. And I'm not talking about back then when the memory happened. I'm talking about now. As they're talking about this story, does something stand out to them? Is there a part of that memory that feels the worst part of that memory? Again, sometimes they have the answer, sometimes they don't. But then I'm asking, how does this memory make you feel about you? They may answer, I'm not good enough. That's a primary emotion that's getting triggered. Also, this experience of getting 5 A's and a B and being hounded by their parents to get good grades, which 5 A's and a B are good grades, it may not seem as someone as a traumatic incident. However, when we bring in little t traumas and we start to understand how memory networks inform our present thoughts and beliefs, we start to view this incident differently. Yes, there can be big T traumas that happen. I usually describe big T traumas as something that happened that most people, if they heard that story, would acknowledge that that's going to leave an impact, that that wasn't something that should have happened. It's something we can put our finger on, and we have common sense that says, yeah, that's not how we should be treating children. This also doesn't happen for everybody. Not everyone's going to agree with it because, you know, you can have those, I don't know, what are they, like memes or something that go around social media that say something like, yeah, I got spanked as a child and whatever, just dismissing that abuse. So maybe not everybody would agree with it, but most people are going to see that as being a traumatic event. Little T traumas, on the other hand, they don't score high in regards to impact, but they do score high in terms of consistency or frequency. So sometimes the big T trauma, it only happened once or it only happened twice. But dad yelling happened once a week, twice a week. Sometimes when he was out of his job, every day it would happen. So again, those little T traumas may not in our mind be hitting the same area of the big T trauma. But what we know in PTSD assessments is that consistent, frequent little T traumas often score as high as a big T trauma for individuals. When clients start to go down memory lane, so to speak, they start to access memories that often in therapy we haven't discussed yet, but they are emotionally, somatically connecting because that's the way the brain has linked these associations together. And it's an interesting journey, both I think for me as a therapist and clients. Sometimes we're talking about something that's happening somatic and a memory, and they don't have access to this other memory yet. And the session ends and they come back the next week and they'll report, hey, I was feeling that emotion in my body. I became aware of it. I started asking myself some questions like, how far back does this feeling go? How old does this feel? And all of a sudden they give me a memory and they say, I don't think I've shared this with you. I don't know that it really stood out to me before. What we've already discussed, but I feel like it bears repeating, is that present difficulties that the client is coming to therapy for help with are informed by past experiences that are inadequately processed. We might have these secondary emotions that they're aware of, that people are having conversations with or setting boundaries around, or that are causing them problems in their life. And they're aware of that, but they're coming in. And what they don't know is that this current difficulty or this present difficulty is being informed by past experiences that were not adequately processed, or they have not been resolved in adaptive ways. And so our job in therapy is to map out that emotional territory, the memories, and work with the client to create safety so that they can bring these memories into awareness. And then we can start to target them in a very straightforward, systematic way. Often this is one of the trauma modalities, in order to give the client the opportunity to reprocess these experiences. So now in the present, they may be noticed as a trigger, but the client is not trapped by this when it gets triggered. Now, when this gets triggered, they understand the trigger, they can make sense of it, and they can move from the secondary emotion that initially surfaced to the primary emotion, which goes all the way to the core wound of feeling unwanted, unlovable, not enough, unsafe, or overly responsible. When we're talking about attachment injuries, I think it's important that we understand attachment injuries are a feeling state in the body. And they are also multi-layered wounds from childhood into adulthood. In order to heal and have relationships that repair safety and love, the client has to be able to move from their secondary emotions to their primary emotions, often having a safe witness, whether that's their therapist, their friend, a therapy group member, a sponsor, or their partner who attunes to them and is present. The saying that I use when working with clients, and even as I'm supervising new therapists, is the absence of the negative doesn't automatically translate into something that's positive and adaptive. So what do I mean by that? When we're healing from childhood trauma, especially neglect or emotional wounding, we sometimes assume as adults or as therapists that just removing the pain or the dysfunction would naturally lead to health and well-being. But that's not always the case. Just because something negative like chaos, criticism, or abuse is no longer present doesn't mean the person has developed the skills, the beliefs, or internal safety that's needed to thrive. For example, a person who grew up in a critical household might stop hearing critical voices as an adult, either because they've distanced from those relationships or they've gone to therapy, or they're in a healthier relationship. But that doesn't automatically mean they've developed self-compassion or confidence or a stronger inner voice. They might still struggle with crippling self-doubt, even though the external criticism is gone. In other words, healing isn't just about what we remove, it's also about what we build in its place. We need to actively grow new patterns, internal resources, and relational experiences that are positive and adaptive, like trust, secure connection, healthy boundaries, and emotional regulation. The absence of pain is a start, but it's not the same as the presence of wholeness. Now, for individuals who grew up in environments where love or safety or emotional attunement were missing, or worse, where there was active harm like abuse or betrayal, sex addiction often becomes a coping mechanism. It's not about sex, it's about regulating overwhelming emotions, numbing pain, or trying to get a fleeting sense of connection or control, which again may be a maladaptive way of regulating, but still, that's where we are. In those early environments, connection felt unsafe, maybe dangerous, or unavailable. So they developed protective strategies like compartmentalization, secrecy, or emotional distancing to survive. As adults, they might find a partner who is safe, consistent, and loving. The chaos may be gone. The active harm may be over. But again, here's the key. The absence of danger doesn't automatically create the ability to feel safe, to open up, or experience true intimacy. Those are learned capacities that have to be actively built through healing. So for this person instead, they might still feel suspicious of love or care. They might push away closeness just when it becomes emotionally meaningful. They might numb or detach when vulnerability is required. They may sexualize emotional needs or avoid sex altogether with a safe partner. And they may still feel like they don't deserve real connection because they never learned how to tolerate closeness, to regulate fear within intimacy, or trust that their needs won't be used against them. Their nervous system still interprets connection as a threat, even if their conscious mind knows otherwise. Healing in this context means not just stopping the negative behavior, like compulsive sex or porn use, but building the positive skills and internal safety that make healthy intimacy possible. That's what I mean when I say the absence of the negative doesn't automatically translate into something positive and adaptive. We have to create new emotional blueprints, earned secure attachment by doing the slow, deliberate work of showing up for ourselves and for others in ways that we were never taught. This comprehensive and systemic approach to treating clients who've carried these wounds throughout their lives allows not only for them to reprocess the pain or trauma from the past, but also to support developmental repair, meaning we help clients build the emotional, relational, and self-regulation skills they never had the chance to develop. Because healing isn't just about resolving past harm. It's about creating the internal structures and capacities that we're missing. This way, clients can begin to fully engage with the present, not just free from the past, but equipped with the tools and confidence to navigate life with greater resilience, connection, and authenticity. Now, if you're a therapist and you're treating interpersonal trauma, which is what I'm largely talking about here, trauma that happened interpersonally, meaning in our close relationships, then we need to treat it interpersonally. That is, while we're reprocessing these experiences with clients, there's a parallel process that's going on at the same time, where while the client is revisiting these experiences in the past, they're also in the present room with us, the therapist, and their bodies are talking to our bodies are talking to their bodies. So that's one thing that's going on in a therapy session. The other thing that's going on is that we are being, in an interpersonal approach, we are being with them in a relational way. Now, that doesn't mean that as the therapist, we're getting as much out of the session as our client is. We're bringing our issues in. No, that's not what that means. But we're being with them in a relational way, and that might mean we're being mindful. We're present. We're keeping our hearts open to what's happening in the room. And we're attuning with this client. For many clients, it's not just about a resolution of the negative. It's also about giving them the opportunity to have a full range of emotional responses to what actually occurred in the past. Let's say, for example, you're working with someone who was severely abused as a child, where they were so terrified of their primary caregivers that they never said a word. They were compliant and they did what they needed to keep themselves safe. Now in therapy, or specifically when we're doing trauma therapy, they're getting into not just what happened and how these memories encoded, but now what's starting to happen, because they're here with us in the room, in the present with us, and the therapist is being a witness to their experience. They're inviting them, sometimes actively, sometimes just by being there, to have all of the emotions now in the present that any reasonable person would have, given what actually occurred. They get to be mad. I'll hear clients say, who does that? Who does that to a kid? They get to be sad. They get to be hurt. They get to relate to the betrayal that they experienced, where someone who loved them was also someone who hurt them. And that's something that happens for the first time. And that's something that doesn't happen automatically, because not all clients, even as adults, are emotionally prepared to face that kind of truth. And yet we know as therapists that when we can help them approach what actually happened to them so that they can have a more adult understanding of what happened to them as children, they can get to the other side of it. It's the relationship in that moment to moment unfolding of the experience where we're either co-regulating their affective experience, we're helping them tolerate pain that they couldn't tolerate left to their own devices, and we're helping them get to the feelings of anger that also left to their own devices they would avoid if not shut down altogether, because that's what they've always done. And as a therapist, we have to be with them every step of the way. I posted something on our Healing Paths Instagram page the other day that says, let me pull it up. If anyone is going to magically appear and suddenly make your life better, just know that person is always going to be you. As therapists, we're helping them as an adult understand what happened to them as a child. And as we're showing up for them in the present, they're also able to show up for their child in the past, their child self in the past. So let's talk about what happens with primary emotions and core wounds, or let's just say with attachment trauma or complex PTSD. There's several things that get confused in that child's development to adulthood. So one of those things is there's confusion between self and other. There's frequently an over-identification with the perpetrator. You're treating me bad, therefore it must be because I am bad. The clinical challenge here is to externalize the responsibility and to place it where it belongs. That doesn't belong with a 5-year-old. That would never belong to a 4-year-old. The child, who is now an adult, may know it's not my fault that I was abused, but that's not how it feels in their body. And let me just say, don't we all have that example in our own life narrative of, I know I'm a good person, like intellectually, I know I'm a good person, or I know I can do this, I know I'm capable, but that's not how it feels in my body. And maybe that's a source of torment when that's your daily life experience. I think with healing, we should all be so lucky to have what's on the inside be congruent with what's on the outside, or what's the feeling is in our body is congruent with the belief that we have, with the empowered belief that we have. So this fundamental confusion of responsibility, or what I refer to as defectiveness, I'm the defective one, I'm the bad one, it's my fault, is predominant. It's a very pervasive confusion for a lot of clients. And for clients with complex trauma, they're confused on many layers. This isn't the only one. This feeling of being overly responsible or somehow defective. The one I've been talking about is confusion of responsibility. Another one, or the second one, is about safety. If your sense of safety as a child was compromised or ruptured growing up, you never knew when you were going to get hit. You never knew when you were going to get yelled at. You never knew if somebody was going to be home or not. So there's a chronic sense of uncertainty, unpredictability, and powerlessness. Now let's fast forward into adulthood. You continue to be vigilant about that same kind of uncertainty and unpredictability. Long after those conditions have passed, you rage over your spouse coming home late or not being where they told you they were going to be. And let's say in this case, there's nothing secretive. They're not hiding anything. It just got delayed or it took longer than they anticipated. While these are all past, present confusions, safety is about the condition of safety in the past versus the conditions of safety in the present. Meaning we're scanning for this threat, even though the threat happened long ago. I often hear clients talk about a fear that they have. They might say, my worst fear is I'm going to be abandoned. They might say, there was one just this past week that a client said, my worst fear is that I'm not enough. So they'll say these things. And, if I have the relationship with them, if we're in this place of working together, if not, I'll just kind of put it in my back pocket to use later. But if we're in this place of working together where I can say this, I may say, you're talking about this fear as though it's a fear of something that might happen down the road. And can I just point out that this fear of being abandoned, this fear of not being enough, this fear of not being accepted, the stories you've told me, that already did happen. The stories that you've told me about your life, it seems to me like that fear already happened. This is something from the past. And sure, you might have a fear about that continuing into the future or being present here and now. But I don't think we're talking about a future fear that may happen someday. I think what we're talking about happened already. It happened in the past. And then the final area of confusion or of trauma or of memory networks are around power and control, or the ability to make choices, good choices or bad choices on our own behalf. So if we go back and we're thinking about developmental trauma, meaning trauma that happens while the individual is developing, and being a kid, think about being a kid. We have very little control on a good day about the choices that are made for us, the things that we can and can't do. And if we're given too much control, that doesn't feel safe either. But let's stick with this. Somebody else is making those choices for us. So in part, we're rendered powerless just by virtue of the fact that we're children. And there are adults in charge and in control most of the time. Or worse, if you're being abused as a child and you're powerless to that, you're helpless. You can't do anything about what's happening to you. And if you've had too many victimization experiences, what you come into adulthood with is you continue to feel and act as if you're powerless and that bad things keep happening to you and you have no control over them. For sex addicts, one of the common ways they deal with this is through their addiction. Their addiction is just the secret thing that is there for them. It has been there for them. It's predictable, it's accessible, it doesn't reject them. So these memory networks I just talked about, responsibility, defectiveness or value, safety, power and control, are common confusions for clients who've had pervasive developmental trauma. And part of what we're doing in therapy from the very beginning is to listen for those themes so that we can understand where the client lives emotionally most of the time. And to begin to think about how to prioritize what we want to work on to help them feel more safe in the world, in their world. So they can feel like they have more agency, more control. They're empowered. They feel better about themselves. And they no longer have a secretive life, which allows them to develop an authentic self. I believe the work that we're doing is I believe that we're asking our clients to be brave, to venture into uncharted emotional territory that they have spent the better part of a lifetime avoiding. And if they think about it, they have no reason to approach this, except for the fact that what they've been doing isn't working so well anymore. And I also say, if we're asking our clients to do that, we have to meet them there by being courageous ourselves. And while that may sound a bit philosophical, it is my stance and it informs my approach. I'm looking for what is it that is going to make it possible? Where's the opening for us to do a piece of work together that makes it possible for something to happen for the first time that couldn't happen before now? What's the reason to do this work? Now, in this episode, I've covered the reasons why clients do this work. But I also want to ask therapists, because I know I have therapists who listen to my podcast. I want to ask you the same question. What is it that makes you do this work? When I'm supervising and training a new therapist, I see them struggle with a couple of things frequently, which I think some of them are common struggles in our profession. So the first one is we are taught to do no harm. And we all got that message loud and clear from the moment we stepped into graduate school. Well, okay, maybe not all of us. There are therapists who do harm and cross boundaries that we were told never, never, never to cross. But for those of us who heard that we should do no harm, what that translates to in the sense of therapists is that therapists can play it so safe that they miss opportunities to offer healing where healing is in fact possible. Another aspect for therapists is, I think, the idea of being an expert and helping clients with complex PTSD to heal can feel intimidating to therapists, even those who have been trained in this. So they look for info to help their clients. Their list of books to read and podcasts to listen to is endless. And there is a belief that if they read or consume enough info, they will feel more informed as to how to help their clients heal. But the truth is, our clients can read the same books. They can listen to the same podcasts. And now today they have ChatGPT that many people are using instead of seeking out a therapist. I think the good news here for our profession is that therapy isn't really about the transformation of knowledge to the client. The secret is to help clients ground your feet on the floor, clear your emotional energy, make eye contact with your client, listen, be present, and watch for your timing, because you will find it. You will feel the response that is needed. And that's not coming from a book or a podcast. I think the last aspect I want to talk about is, because we work with clients that have been severely traumatized and damaged by the lack of care, by the lack of attunement, a lack of appreciation, a lack of love, so damaged that they believe that they're actually far more damaged than they might be. Sometimes we focus too much on the trauma. Sometimes their focus is too much on the trauma, and then our focus is too much on the trauma, and not enough on their capacities for change. Now, this isn't significant, huge steps, leaps and bounds overnight. It's small, incremental change and progress. Our clients and we can focus too much on the trauma that we miss their capacity for change. We miss the person who survived the trauma and is sitting in our office saying, help me with this. Saying, I want things to be different. Those are powerful motivators for change. It requires us as therapists to see beyond the story of where they got and learn about the story that got them there, as well as the story that got them here to our office, and to the fact that they're asking for help. Their healing is not only up to us. We can be a big part of their healing, but we have to believe that their body, their brain, and their nervous system is capable of healing. Our job is to help them dig out from the layers of protection they have accumulated so that they can heal. Now, I'm not saying that reading, listening to podcasts, having conversations with other professionals, or pursuing the training and consultation needed isn't important. It is, it absolutely is, and I do it. And I see that as a valuable contribution to our profession, but it isn't all that we need. It can inform us for sure. Now, my hope is that it informs us that we can't just show up in our head with all the knowledge that we've accumulated. Instead, it informs us how to show up in the room or in the online session with our client and make room for them to be real and for us to be real with them. As they learn to receive this, they can learn to offer this outside of session. They can get through some really difficult steps in healing, and they can learn to offer this outside of session in their personal lives, in their relationships. And not only can they offer this, but they can receive it as well, which is what recovery is all about. Whether that's recovery from addiction and betrayal trauma, or recovery from childhood trauma and insecure attachment. The work we are doing is leading clients to give and receive love, which shouldn't that be what recovery finally gives people? Now, as I wrap up this episode, I want to challenge you. Take time this week to practice identifying your emotions. Do they align to the situation? I will add here, sometimes somebody gave you a compliment, a genuine compliment. Can your emotions receive that in a way that aligns to that situation? Or are you blocking that? Can you notice how this awareness impacts your interactions? I'd love to hear about your experiences. So please share your insights on our social media accounts. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, share, and leave me a comment. Take care. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.